morning. My task this morning is to introduce the book of Hebrews that we're going to be looking at over the next few weeks. And it's always an interesting challenge to take a whole book and try and sum up what the message is to us of the whole book, particularly with a book like Hebrews, which sits in an awkward kind of place in the New Testament. It's not a gospel. It's not a history like the book of Acts. It's also not one of Paul's letters, even though sometimes we talk about it as a letter and people will sometimes talk as if Paul was the author. The tradition that Paul wrote the book of Hebrews only emerged in the 3rd or 4th centuries AD. And it seems like that was sort of a way of taking a book that had been anonymous and saying, well, Paul said lots of smart things, so he must have said this too. But the book isn't even really a letter. There's a very short letter closing that's kind of stuck on the end. But when scholars have looked at the book and said, what kind of book is this? They've concluded that it's a sermon. More than anything else, this is essentially the text of a sermon that maybe couldn't be spoken in person, and so an early Christian leader sent it in writing, probably to the church in Rome. And we get to listen in to a beautifully written, very eloquent sermon in some of the best written Greek in the New Testament that was probably sent to the Christians in Rome between 60 AD and 80 AD. So we're talking about 2nd or 3rd generation Christians living probably in Rome. And above all else, this sermon is written in order to try and address a problem in Rome, and that problem is Christian exhaustion. I'm sure exhaustion isn't anything that any of us are familiar with. But the exhaustion that the Christians in Rome seem to have been facing was related to, in part, their ordinary life. Their ordinary life would have been grindingly difficult compared to what we have to endure. I mean, I feel sorry for myself when the spring is broken on my garage door at home, so it's harder to lift than usual, and I have to actually put things down to open the garage door to put the recycling in. We have to remember that Christians in the first century dealt with a daily life that meant far longer hours than most of us ever work. It meant far heavier physical labor than most of us ever face. And it just was a daily grind without a lot of social safety net to try and put food on the table again. And people died relatively young because of it, because their bodies were just completely worn out. Now, on top of that, Christians in Rome faced some kinds of struggles and frustrations because of their faith. And the preacher, the writer of the sermon here, doesn't tell us exactly what kind of persecution they were facing, but we probably shouldn't be thinking in terms of them being thrown to the lions in the amphitheater or anything like that. That sort of really state-sponsored violent persecution happened briefly for a few months under the Emperor Nero in the early 60s, but aside from that, didn't happen until later in the church's history. But that doesn't mean people didn't face problems because of their faith. The biggest problems people faced were with things like finding a spouse for their children, getting a job, getting a loan. And why? Because in the ancient city of Rome, like most ancient cities, life and society ran on patronage. And for us, patronage is a bad word, right? If we talk about patronage in government, that means there's a scandal. Somebody has known somebody in government and given them kickbacks in order to get a contract maybe for a higher price than they would get it otherwise. And we see that as a kind of corruption. Well, that was just business as usual in ancient Rome. The way everything worked was by knowing somebody who was a little bit higher on the totem pole than you, who could act as your patron. And then that person would go over to the owner of the bakery down the road and say, hey, would you give my friend a job? And that's how you would get a job. Or they would go to the judge and say, hey, would you go easy on my friend here? And the judge would go easy on you. Or they would go to another friend and say, hey, do you know any people who have a daughter of marriageable age who'd marry my friend's son? And they'd set up a marriage. But Christians looked weird in the eyes of most early Romans. They believed in some kind of weird crucified man who'd come back from the dead. I mean, who'd ever heard of worshiping somebody who'd been crucified? And they met early in the morning to do who knows what, and they just seemed kind of creepy. I mean, you didn't trust them around your family. They were weird. And so it was really hard for Christians to get patrons. It was hard for Christians to foster the kind of relationships that allowed them to function well as part of society. And they suffered for it. And it may just be that kind of long-term, slow but exhausting pressure that was leading a lot of people in Rome to start asking, is Jesus really worth it? Is it really worth it to keep pushing? Why don't I just say Jesus isn't for me and go back to the synagogue? Now, why the synagogue? Well, because most of the things that people saw as different and attractive in the early church was also there in traditional Judaism too. After all, the early church was just a branch of early Judaism. And so a lot of what people got when they came to church, they got if they went to synagogue too. You were worshiping the same God, you were monotheists, you had the same kind of high ethics. And the synagogue didn't even require people to keep all of the food laws and be circumcised and everything. They would let you come and just be a God-fearing Gentile and get in on Israel's thing without the hard bits. But most importantly, Judaism had existed in the city of Rome for several generations as a respected national tradition, a respected national religion. And so while they sometimes came in for some xenophobic pressure, depending on the ruler, usually they had a good position in society. It was easy for Jews to get patrons. So why not? Hey, say, why am I putting up with all of this pressure? Why am I making life so hard for myself by following Jesus when I could just get most of the same stuff down the road at the synagogue? And the preacher of the sermon in Hebrews is saying, you don't get all the same stuff. Jesus is uniquely fantastic. And there are things that you have in Jesus that you won't find anywhere else. Now, before I get into his main ideas, I just want to touch on the controversy around the book of Hebrews, which relates to the relationship between Christianity and Judaism. Because the book of Hebrews is really all about how Jesus is better than what was going on before Jesus in Judaism. And some people have tried to read the book in different terms and say, no, this wasn't saying that Jesus was better, and say, no, there are two equally valid ways to Israel's God, Judaism and early Christianity. But I just don't see that in the book to the Hebrews. I mean, more clearly than anywhere in the New Testament, the author seems to be saying, all of the things that were good in Judaism all of the reasons to be part of Israel are even better when you are a Jew or when you follow Israel's God and have Jesus. That Jesus is the fulfillment of everything that was in Judaism. And so why would we say that they're equally beneficial? The author seems to be wanting it precisely to say, no, don't go back to the synagogue. Stay here worshiping Christ because it's better. That doesn't necessarily translate into the way we relate to Jews in the contemporary world. And I think this is where people sometimes get confused. I think we can recognize that Jews today do worship the same God we do, that often they worship that God as faithfully as they know how. And we don't necessarily have to say, well, yeah, God just gave us two paths up the same mountain, in order to say we hope that God will be merciful and accept the faith and the devotion that many Jews offer him, even if we're not sure, even if we're not certain what God has in store for them. We can treat Jews today in hope rather than in condemnation. But that doesn't mean that we say there isn't something else that we gain by being in Christ. That's a reason to be here. That's a reason to come and follow Jesus as the fulfillment of God's purposes. And that's really what the letter to the Hebrews is all about. So, why is it better to have Jesus? First of all, the author of the Hebrews stresses that in Jesus we have an access to God that we don't have anywhere else. Now, Israel already had an amazing access to God in a couple of different ways. They had the law of Moses. And if you think about it, it's incredible to imagine God actually dictating a way of life to a human being. And the God who so often we say, God, what should I do? And we wish that he would just come down and speak to us directly. He actually spoke directly to Moses and gave Moses instructions for people to follow so that they could live well and be in relationship with him. How incredible is that? And God spoke through the prophets. When Israel wasn't getting it quite right, God didn't just leave them to their own devices, but spoke to them again. And God came and made his presence tangible in the temple with his people, so that the priests could go into the temple and relate to God face to face on behalf of the people. That was an incredible access to God that Israel enjoyed. And all of that was good. But the author of Hebrews is saying, in Jesus, God gives us even more access to himself. Because Jesus, he stresses, was the very being and imprint of God. Jesus was so much God that God allows his name and his honor and worship to be given to Jesus when it's not legitimate to worship any other gods. Somehow Jesus is the face of God. Jesus is where we meet God. It's Jesus' words through which God created the heavens and the earth, somehow. And the author of Hebrews is struggling to find language to express how God is completely present immediately, face to face, when people are face to face with Jesus. There aren't anymore any intermediaries, whether it's Moses or the prophets or even angels. You're face to face with the Creator God. And yet at the same time, Hebrews also emphasizes more than any other book the humanity of Jesus, that Jesus became human in all of the same senses we're human. There isn't any aspect of our struggles as a human being that Jesus didn't have to go through. So that when God meets us face to face, even though God in himself is entirely other, is so far beyond us that we can't even grasp the beginning of what it means for God to be God. The God who meets us in Jesus understands us from the inside out because he has been one of us. What better access to God can we imagine? And I think sometimes we take that for granted. We take for granted that we can stop and pray and that Jesus is there for us to speak to, that Jesus understands us at the bottom of ourselves, and that Jesus is God's face to us without any barriers. But the author of Hebrews is saying, don't take it for granted, because Jesus is the only place where we get that. Not only is Jesus giving us a better access to God than we've ever had before, but he says, in Jesus we have a better solution to the problem of our brokenness than we find anywhere else. Which isn't to say that Israel didn't already have ways that God had given them of dealing with sin and brokenness. So Israel had the temple and priests and the sacrificial rituals. And all of that was designed to make it possible for people who were broken, people who can't successfully, consistently live in harmony with God's will, to approach a God whose will and whose word make reality. I mean, just think about it for a second. If somebody's very thoughts become real, and you decide, I don't want to do what that God says I should do, and you come and approach that God, how can you even exist anymore when that God thinks or says what you're doing isn't the way I want it to be? Whatever that God says becomes reality. And so you either cooperate with that God's will, cooperate with that God's mind, or you cease to be. This is why Israel understood that God's presence was dangerous. Not because God was vindictive and mean, but because ultimately God was an artist who was creating a cosmos with a certain pattern to it. And ultimately, whatever God wants happens. Whatever God thinks becomes reality. And our only choice, if we don't want to go along with that pattern, with that design that God's creating, is ultimately the choice of our own death, the choice of our own non-existence, which is why sinful people walk into the holy place in the temple and fall down dead. But the priests made it possible, when they were specially prepared, to have a human being go into the Holy of Holies once a year and relate to God face to face under the right circumstances, with all the right preparation, so that he wouldn't die, and so that humanity and God could meet face to face again. Why? In the hope that Israel, as God's people, would eventually be transformed and become able to cooperate with God's will, become able to live out God's pattern, so that God's beautiful design for the cosmos could be realized with us as part of it. That's what the temple was all about. That's what the sacrifices and the priesthood were all about. Except that it kept having to be done over and over again. Every year, the high priest had to go into the Holy of Holies, into God's presence again, and offer the sacrifices again. And the people never quite were transformed so that they could do it on their own. The people never quite were fully changed so that they could enter God's presence themselves. the priests still continually had to represent them. And the priests themselves were flawed, so that they had to tie a rope around the waist of the priest and feed out line while he walked into the Holy of Holies, so that in case he wasn't well enough prepared and fell down dead in the presence of God, they could pull him out again. And the author of Hebrews says, as amazing as it is that God has done all of this to allow broken people to continue relating to him, we have so much more in Jesus, because Jesus has become a high priest for us, just like the priests for Israel. Except now we have a representative who doesn't just go into the physical temple in Israel, he's gone into the heavenly temple, where God's complete, direct, unfiltered presence is, where nothing exists except what's in harmony with God's will. And our priest is there, face to face with the Father. And not only is our priest there, but our priest is there giving one offering in his own blood that never has to be repeated. It's enough to be like the Day of Atonement offering, like the Yom Kippur offering, that covered all of Israel's sins for a whole year, except now it's not just for a year, now it's for all time. So that now you and I can follow Jesus and be transformed and come into that direct presence of God eventually ourselves. Making a way for our brokenness, not just to be tolerated by God, but ultimately to be healed. We have then a better access to God. We have a better solution to our brokenness. And the author of Hebrews says we have a better future. All through Hebrews, the preacher uses the metaphor of Israel's wandering in the wilderness on the way to the promised land after the Exodus for our state right now. And he says, yeah, life sucks. It's not the way it's supposed to be. It's hard. It's grueling. And yeah, following Jesus sometimes just seems to make things harder. Just like for Israel, they came out of Egypt and landed in the desert with no water and no food. And God eventually provided for them, but man, they got pretty thirsty and pretty hungry before he did. And they had to wander, and they struggled to trust him. And the writer to the Hebrews is saying, you're in that same position. I get it. But remember where the Israelites ended up. They ended up in the promised land, which was the land flowing with milk and honey, which was the place where finally they could rest and build houses and plant farms and not have to keep walking and not have to deal with scraping every bit of food and water out of the desert. And the author of the Hebrews says, if that was rest, if that was a fantastic end to their struggle, think about how amazing the rest is that you're going to have in the resurrection of the dead. Because you're going to have a kind of rest that Israel has never yet been able to have, even at their best in the promised land. You know, if we think about the days that are the hardest and most exhausting, the days when we feel most like just giving up, when you're chewed out by your boss and you realize that you did something wrong on the project you're working on, so you look like a fool to your coworkers, and somebody rear-ended your car on the way home, and you come in the front door and the cat puked on the rug. The kind of rest that you long for on those days, that is the rest, Hebrews says, that you have waiting for you. And so the other half of the message in Hebrews is just hold on. It's worth it because of what we have in Jesus now and what we have to hope for. And so hold on. Don't buy into the voice in the back of your head that says it'd be easier somewhere else. For us, the temptation usually isn't going to be to go back to Judaism, but there are lots of other alternatives as a way of living life that sometimes seem like they'd be a lot easier. Sometimes it's just living a secular life, focusing on the things we enjoy day to day and not thinking about anything beyond that. Just having a beer on the patio with your friends, enjoying playing with your grandkids, hanging out with our friends at the mall. That happens both in your teens and later on. There's nothing wrong with any of those good things. That's part of the blessings that God gives us in life. But the temptation is to treat them as all that life is and just let ourselves coast in our spiritual lives. And the author of the Hebrews says, don't give up because of your exhaustion. Don't become, in practice, a secularist because you've lost the energy to keep pushing forward in your relationship with God. Because you've lost the drive to still want your life to be part of the work God's doing to heal the world. So I think for many of us, whether we find ourselves tempted to give up our faith entirely sometimes, or whether we're just tempted to coast and take the easy way out, we need to hear as well just the reminder of what we have in Jesus, and a reminder that it's possible to hang in. It's possible to keep putting one step in front of the other, and that it's worth it. And that in the end, we will be overwhelmingly glad that we stuck it out. What does that mean practically speaking? Maybe it means this week taking the time to sit down for 5 minutes and say to God, God, how do I deepen my relationship with you? Or God, where is it that you want me now for the next few months to be helping in whatever you're trying to do in people's lives? Show me the piece of your work that you want me to be part of. Recently for me, the next step was something relatively straightforward. It was taking the things that I want to pray about, and when I tell somebody I'm going to pray for them, putting it on my to-do list in my phone, the one I use for work, so that in the middle of my work day, when I'm looking back at my to-do list to decide what to do next, I see, oh yeah, I'm supposed to pray for them, and I stop and I take 30 seconds and pray for them in the middle of my day. I've struggled my whole life with following through on prayer, and this was something I tried to just say, let me finally find a way to remind myself to do it. And it's actually worked decently well. Small step, baby step, but it's continuing to say, I'm not just going to coast, I'm not just going to give up. I'm going to do that one more thing because I believe that I have something in my relationship with Jesus that's worth the effort and that will be unimaginably worth it in the end. Amen.